Welcome to Words on Words, a podcast presented by the University of Nevada, Reno Writing Center. Welcome to Words on Words. I am your host, Iris, as always, and today I'm joined by Jordan for our discussion on sports fiction. Jordan, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, thanks for having me, Iris. I'm Jordan. I am a senior at the university. I'm a writing consultant, and I really love sports, and I really love fiction. And I'm a journalism major, and I love sports writing, and I love sports broadcasting, and sports fiction has been kind of a way to fuel my passions for these subjects.
So what counts as sports fiction? Is it just fiction that has like baseball in it, or is it where the main characters are playing a sport, the main purpose of the story is playing a sport? So if you want to kind of define what sports fiction is for you or for the purpose of our discussion.
Well, there's different varieties of sports fiction. So usually what qualifies in my book as sports fiction,
no pun intended,
is that there is some sports relation in the book and sports reference, but usually it's just like there's different levels. So for example, if a book has just a brief little tidbit about sports, but there's a deeper message in it, it's still sports fiction. But I think that those are the books I'm starting to get more involved with, at least. So like there's more substance to it than just they're playing sports the whole time. Okay. I know when I first started reading in like elementary school, I read sports fiction. It was just like, okay, like here's a kid and he's playing baseball and here's the big game.
Yeah.
But now
end of story.
End of story, and there was no real message behind it. But now I read sports that are like, there's sports fiction, but they're about like, oh, there's drama involved, or there's romance. There's different stuff involved in those sports fiction.
Interesting.
But as you might be able to tell, the category of sports fiction, there's not that many books about it.
I was going to say, what would you say is your favorite book, the number one, numero uno, the Colossus of Clout, if you will?
Let's see, my favorite sports fiction book. I really like this book I read. It's by my favorite sports fiction author. His name's Carl Duker, and there's more substance to these kinds of books. Basically, in the book, it's called Gutless. It's just an unbelievable book because when I was reading it, it just had all of these real-life issues presented in it besides sports, but they use sports as kind of a lens on how to see these issues. It's really interesting, but it was about this one individual who he was in high school and he was a senior, and he moved from high school to high school, and he had to start on the sports team again and kind of incorporate himself into the lineup and stuff. But it's like, okay, you don't realize sometimes when you move from a high school to high school, the difficulties that are present, they're like, oh, you just pick up and you still play sports. Yeah. But there's so many different factors that go into it. Also, another thing that was interesting is they had like there's plot twists and stuff. So he got really close to this guy, and he found out that this player that he's been working with, he was a great athlete, and all of a sudden he started not playing very well. And he kind of talked to him about it. And his friend was like his best friend, the first person that he met when he moved to this new town. And it turned out that he was like sexually abused by one of the coaches. And, you know, it's just like there's different kind of categories in sports fictions. And when you might think sports fiction, you're like, okay, this is just about them hitting the ball or whatever. And here's a story about them.
Someone breaks a leg and then they have a recovery.
Or a recovery or stuff. But like when there's real life meaningful issues presented in these sports books, I think that's what makes it quality sports fiction for sure.
Yeah, because like what we had talked about is I don't know that I've ever read sports fiction where the sport was the main idea. I can think of movies. So I was like, we can turn The Sandlot into a book, and that'll be a great kind of book. But you had mentioned for that one that the author was actually your favorite author. What was his name again?
His name's Carl Duker.
Okay, and what other books does he write, or what kind of writing does he do that makes him kind of this idol of an author?
He's definitely one of the most prominent sports fiction authors out there.
Okay.
I started reading his books a few years ago. He has about 6 or 7 of them. I've read each of his books probably 10 times a piece.
Oh, wow.
I've liked him so much.
That's time I don't have.
Yeah, exactly. Not anymore, but I just love him. He really just describes different situations, real life issues, and he's written books about an athlete who his best friend on the team died. and stuff like that, and how he copes from it. Or he's
uplifting.
Very uplifting. And he's talked about other times. There was another time where one of the friends had a really bad at-home life situation, and he was on the team, and he kind of helped him overcome it. So there's different things about overcoming real-life issues that happen in sports and the sports world, and kind of that are under the radar. So it's really interesting to me that the connections that he's able to make between sports and real life problems that, you know, a lot of people face. And I think the one thing, Iris, that is really interesting to me is that there's not too many sports fiction books out there that are of this quality, I guess I should say. And it's because I think a lot of people commonly think you can't read and you can't play sports, you know, like there's like
the kind of jock stereotype mentality.
Exactly. So the genre is really limited because people are taught at such a young age, kind of like, hey, you either read and you go to school and all this stuff, or you play sports. But like my whole life, I was heavily involved in academics, and I loved to read. My mom was a school teacher and was always getting me involved in reading and stuff, so I gained that passion from her. My dad could not stand reading or anything like that and was all about sports. So I gained that passion of sports from my dad. So it kind of like I fused these passions together, and that's why I played high school sports. I am surrounded by sports today. But like I also love to read, and I'm a journalism major, English minor, and I love to read and write. So it's kind of like I wish that more people would see that, yeah, it's okay to read and it's okay to play sports. And it shouldn't be this bridge between them. It should be kind of, you can encompass both. So.
Yeah, and from talking about your favorite book and what you like about it, it sounds like you're finding those books that reflect your own kind of personal experience with sports. Like it's not just sports and it's not just literature. It's kind of the happy marriage of both of these elements. And I think what you're kind of doing is breaking that sort of stereotype about sports fiction. Because I think a lot of people will probably look at it and be like, oh, are they just going to talk about like some kind of historical fiction about like the first baseball team or something, or where it's very much sports heavy, not much about character development, not much about kind of issues that some non-sports person could connect to. But what you're kind of telling me and all of us is that it's not just about football. It's not just about soccer. It's not just about baseball or lacrosse or swimming or whatever. I don't want to be exclusive of, of sports.
No, you are totally perfect.
But it's more so about kind of the people that are involved in that. And that's interesting. I didn't think of that.
Exactly. And I think that's a stereotype kind of that, you know, sports books can't have that kind of substance in it, and that they are just about sports and surround sports, and they just talk about winning the big game and stuff like this. But within these stories and sports stories, more oftentimes than not, you're able to see how these characters handle very difficult situations that they have to overcome that are away from the sports world, but it's just kind of how they're dealing with them by playing sports. I know people who kind of use sports as their escape from the hardships of the world. So it's kind of like, okay, sports help with these issues going on in some people's lives, and it kind of helps them cope with them in a way. So it's like sports sometimes are more than just a game, I guess.
Yeah.
Like I know
it's the camaraderie or like the people or the kind of.
But it's like, even with the camaraderie and stuff, okay, it's like a team, you know.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, there's like a support system that you have, and you have friends and you have family, and they're able to help you resolve some of these issues. But I think like some of these books by like Carl Duker and stuff really highlight the importance of sports that have on the lives of others. But just that there's this connection that even non-sports fans, they can read these books and they're going to enjoy it. But that may be like, oh, okay, it has a sports theme. They're going to be like, okay, I don't like sports. Yeah. But these types of books, they can easily appeal to a variety of different audiences and book lovers everywhere.
So what other kinds of titles or authors would you recommend to either someone who's really not into sports, and so the sports fiction section is not really a section they gravitate to, or someone who's interested in kind of moving away from the archetypal stories of the big game and overcoming an injury or something like that?
Exactly. I have a couple authors here that I think are very prominent as well, besides Carl Duker, but for sure read his. That's a great start. There's other titles, Payback Time, like Heart of a Champion, Swagger. There's just tons of different ones. But also, one author I really like is Walter Dean Myers. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Nope.
He's a very prominent sports writer, and he created a lot of sports fiction books. But what he has in his stories are about just kind of overcoming social problems and social issues into his book. So he was an African-American author, and he passed away a few years ago, sadly. But he kind of talked about how race plays a factor in sports and kind of stuff like that too, and how sometimes it's really difficult to overcome these stereotypes and stuff like that. Another author really good that I like is Edward Bloor, and he wrote a couple of sports books, but he doesn't like exclusively write about sports fiction. But he has a couple of really good ones involving sports, and one of my favorite books of all time is by him. It's called Tangerine. And in Tangerine, it's really, really good, and it's about this individual who is on the soccer team, and he moves. It's like middle schooler, and about or high school, between there. Moves to a brand new school. But there's all these issues going on in the town. One player gets struck by lightning, stuff like that. Jeez. Another time, and he has these really thick, like, Coke bottle glasses. And he doesn't really know, like, why he can't really see very well. Like, why? Like, they always told him he stared at an eclipse too long when he was younger. And that's why he kind of got blinded, kind of. And he kind of believed that narrative. But the whole time, he's kind of, like, remembering bits and pieces of how come his eyes are like that. And he has this brother who's the star player on the high school football team, and he's going to get all these college offers from like University of Florida, Florida State, like prominent college football powerhouses. Mm-hmm. But then at the end of the story, he puts the pieces together, and his brother actually was the one who caused the eye damage on him when he was little. And his brother, so he like ratted his brother out one time when he did something. He got in trouble. So the brother, the high school athlete, kicker, like star player, everyone like loves him in the town, actually used these paint cans and sprayed it into his eyes, and that's what made him like that.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So it's
spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler alert. Sorry. You got to read it. It's unbelievable.
Wow.
Yeah, just like. But it's like, okay, it's the same kind of thing. It's not all about sports. Like, yeah, sure, like the brother was a football player and he played soccer. But like, think of the deeper issues beyond this that go on, and the deeper problems and character development and stuff that goes on through these characters' minds, that it's not all about sports.
So would you kind of recommend these books to people who are in general interested in either social commentary, you mentioned, about kind of race issues and some class issues maybe that are coming up? So people interested in those kinds of literature to not stray away from the sporty look of the book.
Exactly. And sometimes these books will have, maybe they'll have a soccer player on the cover or something like that, and that might kind of draw it away from like the overall message. But these kinds of books they're not exclusively for sports fans, for sure. Like, there's a touch about sports, and that's kind of my draw into it. I like sports a lot. But then I see all of these real-time issues going on and these real-time problems, and I think that this is how we can bridge that gap between people who are like, okay, reluctant sports readers to people who really like enjoy these kinds of books. And there is so many social issues present, stuff like that. These sports books and sports fiction in particular is really a genre for anybody.
Interesting. This might be a question you can't answer, but are there any women in these sports fiction books?
Yeah.
Because so far it's been like middle school boys.
Yeah, there's middle school, there's high school, there's different stuff. There's college in some of them. And there are women in some of these books. And I think that here's another thing very interesting to me. I think there needs to be a variety or a greater number of women writers so that they can kind of depict these experiences that people who played sports and write about it, because a lot of these genres right now it's male dominated for sure. And it is kind of an issue, especially if you're a young lady who wants to start reading these books and get interested in the sports, but then you don't see a player who is a girl. And there are books out there for sure that have women as the like lead sports character and has issues and stuff like that, but it's really kind of rare, and it's really interesting to me. And I have thought about that in the past, and it's like I wonder why, I guess, that this is the case.
I don't know if it's kind of a double-edged sword where women are generally not accepted in sports as seriously as men. So like there's the problem of women not being the focus of sports. So your major league or the women's major leagues, no one, like they don't have a huge following. There's not kind of a ton of revenue coming in there. There's not a lot of viewership for the major women's sports. So I think that's part of it. Then I also think women getting into being taken seriously as a writer of sports fiction in that case. So I feel like it'd be someone had to be a very successful like soccer player. Someone had to be a very successful sports person first before they might be taken seriously writing sports fiction. I don't have any in mind, but I think of like the Bring It On series, like for the films, where that's like kind of women as lead characters of a sports movie, but I wouldn't call that like a earth-shattering like view on on like women and social issues and stuff like that. So I don't know if it's just compounded influences that make it difficult for those to exist.
Yeah, I think too. I mean, the only real prominent movie that comes to mind where a female is one of the lead characters in a sports film is like Bend It Like Beckham.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah,
and
that's
really,
a good one.
That's a great example of a good film. But really, besides that, I mean, there's very few where, you know, there's the lead character is female.
Was Bend It Like Beckham a book?
I think it might have became a book before. I'm not positive on that. I haven't read it. I know I watched the movie a bunch of times, and I really liked it. But
that is a good movie.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a really interesting thing, just like how it's kind of like a weird separation between people who like sports and writing, and now it's like, okay, now letting women into the genre about women who are like stereotypical, like, oh, you're not supposed to really like sports or read or stuff like that, or write, at least if you like sports, to write about sports. It's like a kind of different thing. And that's really interesting to me. And I think it really starts with a lot of the times when if you're like a girl growing up, you don't see like these professional athletes as women as much. There's not a lot of media coverage from it. It's like seeing yourself in the media. That's so important. And it's really, I mean, there's the women's NBA, and that's awesome, but it doesn't get the amount of coverage that like the NBA, where a men's sport, or also like soccer even. Yeah. Like they have the MLS and stuff, but even though the female,
you only hear about that when like
the World Cup or something. And the women's soccer team is the best soccer team in the world, and they could probably beat the men's team because the men's team didn't even qualify for the World Cup this year. And it's just like, it's unfair kind of that the coverage of these athletes is more male oriented instead of female, and I think that translates to the number of books that are created about sports in general, sports fiction, and it's really an issue that I think really needs to be analyzed more.
I was thinking that, well, I did track in high school, so that's not really a team sport.
Kind of a little bit.
You're just sort of by yourself doing. Well, I didn't do relays. Relays are team sport. I did high jump. That's not a team sport. But I don't even know that there are really many books about track for that matter. Like it's always about kind of the big name team sports that are kind of culturally ingrained in all of us, like football. And I mean, I love football, but I mean, I'm not gonna play football. Like I'm not gonna see someone like me playing football. I don't know that I'd see someone like me playing basketball. I mean, there's not really women's major league like softball, I don't think. I don't
Yeah,
really know much about that.
It's really
but it's
all
like
about the Olympics and stuff.
Yeah, that is true. So like it's like the gymnastics teams and kind of like swimming and all this other stuff. That's like once every like 8 years where that really matters. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it's like what goes on in the meantime, Like why do we only hear about these kind of sports and the women playing them only in the Olympics? Why don't we hear about them, how they're qualifying for the Olympics, that journey? How about like what they do in the meantime? Like,
and they're not broadcast on, well, the Olympics is, but like the national championships or world championships, things like that happen with all the sports. I mean, you have like track, indoor, outdoor, nationals, worlds, kind of stuff like that. For gymnastics, that happens every year. I'm sure for lots of other sports, I mean, competitions are on like really obscure channels that you probably don't get. They're not on the main like CBS, NBC kind of
mainstream ESPN
stuff.
And
Yeah,
stuff like
so
that.
so the only way you get there is you have to be interested in it already, and then you have to go find it. It's not like you're going to be flipping through the channels and really finding 7 different networks covering a swim meet or something.
Exactly. And I think if you're flipping through the channels on an everyday basis, you're going to find a basketball game, a baseball game, a football game, even a hockey game now that's kind of moving up. You're going to see that like within the first 30 channels, I guarantee you're going to see 1 or 2 of those. And you kind of have to go into the upper channels on an unknown network to see other sports that are also very important and that people like actually enjoy, kind of like volleyball, for example, or soccer. Even soccer doesn't get the publicity that it does in other areas of the country or the world for that matter. So it's like, if you have to go find you have to seek out that sport if it's not one of the mainstream ones like football, baseball, basketball, all that. And it's interesting.
I wonder if the narratives would be different. So if there was like a novel that featured track as the sport at hand, or one that featured lacrosse or featured volleyball, if the narrative would follow the same kind of track that it does for the football narratives or something like that, if they'd follow that same kind of narrative arc, or if there would be something different, or if there would be a difference in like the culture of the team, or a different like the people that play or something like that we're kind of not getting through sports fiction right now.
I think so, and I think that different social issues affect, different genders, stuff like that. So if there's more books about women playing in sports, I'm sure that there's some issues presented in that genre that you're not going to see in a men's sport like that. And it's just really interesting to me. It just would be great to have that female voice within the sports fiction genre, and I think it would change it, and it would lead to a lot more books. And it is a relatively new genre, especially over the last, I would say, 30 or 40 years it started to develop. Before that, though, there was very few sports fiction books or novels or anything of any kind. It was kind of just the basic fiction, and no one really wanted to make that connection between sports and fiction or venture into that. So it's just interesting how the genre has developed from having just maybe 2 or 3 prominent authors, maybe in the 50s, in the 60s, that like most sports fiction people know about, moving in to kind of where we are today, where there's probably about 12, 13, 14 sports fiction authors. So a huge, still
room to grow.
Still room to grow for sure. And there is a lot of, there's more authors out there for sports fiction, but those are the ones that are like, okay, like these are the best in the field, in the industry. And it's like, with other genres, you have a billion different books about vampires. You have a billion different books, romance books, stuff like that.
Trillions.
Or science fiction, or even historical fiction. Like all these genres have tons of prominent authors. And in this kind of like genre in sports fiction, it's just, there's really not too many, at least quality, prominent sports fiction authors.
Interesting. And on that note, we'd like to inspire you to start writing sports fiction, look into sports fiction, try reading it, try writing it. It sounds like a very diverse kind of genre that anyone can get into, and it sounds like more people should. So I'd like to thank Jordan for joining me today
thanks,
for our
Iris.
awesome conversation. I'd like to thank you, our listener, for tuning in as well. And we hope you'll join us next time.